The galaxy was never truly silent. For 3,000 years, the galactic resonance network hummed with the voices of 43 civilizations, deals struck between star systems, treaties written across light years, the endless chatter of species who had long since mastered the art of coexisting. It was a beautiful noise, layered, ancient, comfortable. Nobody noticed the silence at the edge. Nobody noticed because the edge didn't matter. The outer spiral arms were thin, sparse star systems, poor in resources, unremarkable in every measurable way. The elder races had looked out there once, centuries ago, decided there was nothing worth wanting, and turned their attention back to the glittering core. That was their first mistake. Councillor Vethnara of the Shalkari Assembly was not an important person. She was junior, freshly appointed, assigned to monitor the boring quadrants, the dead zones, the empty corridors, the star systems that generated no trade and no conflict, and therefore no political value whatsoever. She spent most of her shifts watching dust clouds drift on long-range sensors. On the third cycle of her 7th month, she saw something odd. A signal, biological in origin, faint, almost drowned out by background radiation, but structured, intentional. Something was transmitting from a small, unremarkable system orbiting a medium-sized yellow star near the outer edge of the Sagittarius arm. She flagged it, wrote a report, submitted it through 6 layers of bureaucracy. The report was read, acknowledged, and filed under pre-contact species, non-threat classification. A probe was dispatched, a small autonomous unit, the kind the Conclave sent out like breadcrumbs across the galaxy. It arrived at the signal's origin point, recorded 3 orbital cycles of observation, and returned. The footage was unremarkable, a single inhabited world, blue and green, covered largely in water, wrapped in a thin, breathable atmosphere. The dominant species was bipedal, warm-blooded, moderately intelligent. They were burning fossil fuels in their atmosphere and launching primitive chemical rockets into low orbit. A junior analyst in the Vreth Conclave's Observation Bureau watched the footage, made a note, technologically inferior, no FTL capability, no detectable energy weapons, non-threatening, and recommended no further observation. The Conclave agreed. The probe was recalled. Humanity was quietly, professionally, completely forgotten. That was their second mistake. What nobody recorded, because nobody was watching, was what happened over the next 300 years on that small blue world. They went to war with each other, repeatedly, brutally, in ways that would have horrified the elder races who had long since evolved past the concept of total war. They fought with iron and fire, then with steel and explosives, then with splitting atoms and rewriting the rules of what a weapon could even mean. Every time they nearly destroyed themselves, something strange happened. They adapted. Not just technologically, psychologically. Each catastrophe produced generations that were harder, more creative, more desperately determined to survive than the last. They didn't just rebuild, they over-engineered. They didn't just recover, they prepared. As if somewhere deep in the human genome was a voice that whispered, "Something worse is coming, be ready." Their first fusion reactor came online quietly, with no galactic fanfare, in a year they called 2041. Their first FTL drive crude, almost reckless in design, the kind of thing that would make a Vreth engineer weep, worked on the 3rd attempt in 2089. Their first interstellar colony ship launched in 2094, carrying 10,000 people to a world 2 light-years away. It arrived, they survived, they thrived. And nobody noticed, because nobody was watching. In 2301, the Interstellar Naval Commission approved construction of the first Titan-class warship. The project had no poetic name at the time, just a designation, Project Ironspine. It took 11 years to build. It required the combined industrial output of 4 settled worlds. 17,000 engineers worked in rotating shifts across a dedicated orbital shipyard, so large it was visible to the naked eye from the surface of Mars. When it was finished, they named her the ISV Prometheus. She was 4.2 kilometers long. Her hull was composed of an alloy that humanity had developed specifically because conventional materials were, in the words of the lead engineer, embarrassingly inadequate. She carried weapons systems that had been classified so thoroughly that most of her own crew didn't know the full count. She had a medical bay that could treat 6,000 casualties simultaneously. She had a fabrication deck that could manufacture replacement hull sections while underway. She had, in her lower decks, a chapel, because the engineers who built her understood something the elder races had forgotten, that the species which walks into the dark also needs somewhere to sit quietly and remember why it's worth coming home. The Prometheus was not a warship in the way the galaxy understood warships. Galactic warships were elegant, precise, calculated instruments of measured force and diplomatic threat. The Prometheus was something else entirely. She was an answer to a question the galaxy hadn't thought to ask yet. What does a species build when it has been afraid for its entire existence and finally, has the resources to stop being afraid? On the day she launched, the crew of 6,000 stood at observation windows and watched Earth grow small behind them. Some were crying, not from sadness, from something that didn't have a clean translation in any galactic language. Something close to relief. 300 years of silence ended on a Tuesday. A Shalkari merchant vessel, the Quiet Harvest, drifted off course due to a faulty navigation relay and found itself being gently, firmly, and very politely hailed in 17 languages simultaneously. The captain, a four-armed insectoid named Churikvel, sat frozen at his station as the voice came through. Calm, professional, warm even. Unidentified vessel, this is the ISV Prometheus of the United Earth Interstellar Navy. You've drifted into a monitored approach corridor. No cause for alarm, we just want to make sure you're all right. Do you need assistance? Churikvel tried to run a standard vessel classification scan. The scan ran for 6 seconds, an eternity for a system that could classify most ships in milliseconds, and returned a result he had never seen in 30 years of deep space travel. Vessel mass, EXCDS sensor PARAMETRS, reclassify manually. He looked out his forward viewport. The Prometheus hung in space ahead of him like a piece of a planet that had learned to move. Her running lights cast slow, calm patterns across her hull. She wasn't aiming anything at him. She wasn't posturing or maneuvering for dominance. She was just there, patient, enormous, waiting. Churikvel opened the channel with hands that he would later, in his official report, describe as experiencing minor voluntary tremor due to unexpected atmospheric pressure changes. He was lying, his hands were shaking. This is Captain Churikvel of the Shalkari merchant vessel Quiet Harvest, he said carefully. We are undamaged. We have experienced a navigation fault. We would welcome guidance back to our intended corridor. A pause. Then the human voice again, and now there was a face on screen, a young officer with dark eyes and an expression of genuine, uncomplicated helpfulness. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old by her species standards. Of course, Captain, transmitting correction coordinates now. Safe travels. Churikvel filed his report the moment he cleared the system. He included every sensor reading, every scan result, every frame of footage from his external cameras. He flagged it urgent, immediate conclave attention. The report landed on the desk of the conclave's senior intelligence coordinator at 300 station time. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she reached for her communicator and began making calls. The galaxy had, for 3 centuries, been sleeping next to something it didn't understand. It was time to wake up. The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave convened within 48 hours. This was, by conclave standards, essentially instantaneous. Normally, Convening an emergency session required a formal petition signed by no fewer than 7 member species, a preliminary review committee, a scheduling arbitration process, and at least 3 weeks of diplomatic scheduling conflicts. The fact that the full chamber was seated and attentive in under 2 days told every attending delegate exactly how seriously the Churukvel report was being taken. The chamber was built to impress. 400 meters of curved, tiered seating rising toward a vaulted ceiling inlaid with the stellar cartography of the known galaxy. 43 delegation boxes, each climate-controlled and atmospherically tailored to its species' homeworld conditions. At the center, a projection stage capable of rendering imagery at full scale. The footage from the Quiet Harvest played at full scale. The Prometheus filled the projection stage completely. Her bow alone occupied the space of a small building. The delegates sat in silence as the footage ran, the scan results, the size estimate, the weapons array approximations. Several species representatives had brought their own analysts, who were visibly working on portable equipment even as the footage played, running their own calculations, comparing notes in hushed voices. Ambassador Vreth Kalon, senior representative of the Vreth Conclave, a tall reptilian figure with silver scales and 60 years of diplomatic experience, spoke first, as he almost always did. "This is a display vessel," he said, with the calm certainty of someone who has seen Empire's posture before. "A political statement, a young species with something to prove. We have seen this pattern 43 times. They build something impressive, wave it at the first contact they make, and then we sit down together and discuss proportional membership and the gradual integration of their military assets into the conclave framework." Several delegates nodded. It was, after all, the standard pattern. Councillor Shalvurin of the Akarath Dominion did not nod. She was a quiet, methodical figure, gray-skinned, four-eyed, known across the conclave for never speaking unless she had something precise and uncomfortable to say. "Our analysts have reviewed the scan data," she said. "The vessel mass reading is genuine. The scan ceiling was hit. The system did not malfunction. The Quiet Harvest sensors are rated to classify any known vessel class in the galaxy. This vessel falls outside any known class. Furthermore," she paused, and let the pause sit long enough to make the chamber uncomfortable, "the Prometheus is not alone. Cross-referencing the navigation data with our long-range surveys of the Sol system shows at least 7 additional signatures of comparable mass in tight orbit around the third planet." The chamber absorbed this. 7, someone said quietly from the Shalkari box. "At minimum," Shalvurin confirmed. Vreth Kalon's certainty, to his credit, did not shatter immediately. It simply developed visible cracks. "Even so," he said, "we cannot determine armament levels from scan data alone. Mass does not equal capability. A civilian hauler can be the size of a moon." "True," Shalvurin agreed, "which is why I would like to draw the chamber's attention to a secondary detail in the sensor report." She gestured, and the projection shifted, zooming in on a section of the Prometheus hull. "These arrays along the dorsal spine. Our weapons analysts have identified 17 distinct configurations. They have been unable to classify 14 of them using any system in our database." Silence. Not the comfortable, administrative silence of a meeting in progress. A different kind of silence. The kind that settles over a room when everyone has just understood something simultaneously and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. It was a young Shalkari junior delegate, barely a year into her post, still carrying the nervous energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to be diplomatic about everything, who finally said it. "They built all of this while we weren't watching," she said. "We classified them as non-threatening 300 years ago and never looked again, and in those 300 years they went from burning fossil fuels to this." Nobody answered her. Nobody needed to. Vreth Kalon straightened in his chair. "We will send a delegation, formal, well-resourced, aboard the Eternal Accord. We extend the standard welcome. We present the Articles of Galactic Membership. We assess their government, their intentions, their territorial ambitions. He looked around the chamber. We have done this 43 times. We will do it again. With respect, Ambassador, Shalvarin said quietly. The previous 43 times, we were the ones with the larger ships. The GCS Eternal Accord was the most prestigious vessel in the Conclave fleet. She had ferried 43 first contact delegations across the galaxy. Her halls were lined with the preserved artifacts of every species she had welcomed into civilization, a museum of peaceful integration. Her captain had been decorated 11 times. Her diplomatic staff included some of the finest minds in galactic relations. She dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system, prepared for everything. She was not prepared for the 2 Titan-class warships that materialized on either side of her within 4 seconds of arrival. Silent, unhurried, effortless, like 2 mountains that had quietly decided to stand up. Ambassador Lysura, senior diplomat, 40 years of service, a man who had once talked 3 warring species back from a full-scale conflict with nothing but patience and a good translation algorithm, gripped the arms of his chair and said nothing for a very long time. The hail came in before any of his staff could reach their stations. GCS Eternal Accord, this is Admiral Hara Voss, United Earth Interstellar Navy, aboard the ISV Prometheus. Welcome to Sol. We've been expecting you. A brief pause. We've had you on sensors since you entered the outer system. Please follow the navigation guide we're transmitting. Earth is beautiful this time of year, and I think it's important you see her properly. Lysura looked at his senior aide. His senior aide looked back at him. They tracked us, the aide whispered, from the outer system. Lysura straightened his formal robes, composed his expression into 40 years of practiced diplomatic serenity, and opened the channel. Admiral Voss, he said, we are honored. We look forward to meeting you. He cut the channel, turned back to his aide. Tell me everything our analysts have on their weapons systems, he said quietly. All of it, right now. Docking bay of the ISV Prometheus was large enough to swallow the Eternal Accord whole. Ambassador Lysura had been told this by his analysts before arrival. He had processed the information intellectually, nodded at the relevant figures, filed the data point appropriately in his very capable diplomatic mind. He understood on an abstract level what the numbers meant. Understanding numbers and standing inside the thing those numbers described were, he was discovering, entirely different experiences. The Eternal Accord, a vessel that had always seemed large and grand to him, a flagship, a symbol of conclave authority, sat in the Prometheus docking bay like a shuttle, like something you'd use to run errands. The bay doors alone were taller than most buildings he had visited. The deck plating vibrated faintly underfoot with the deep, patient hum of something very large staying very still. The human honor guard was already formed up when the delegation descended the Eternal Accord's boarding ramp. 20 Marines in full-powered exosuits, standing at parade rest, each one still as sculpture. Their suits added half a meter to their height, but Lysura had read the intelligence briefs. The humans inside those suits were not small to begin with. They were a species that had evolved under gravity, that had spent centuries in manual labor and constant physical conflict. They were built differently than most spacefaring races, who had long since engineered away the need for physical robustness. Admiral Hara Voss stood at the front of the honor guard, out of armor, in a formal Navy uniform that was simpler and less decorated than anything the Conclave's senior officers wore. She was shorter than Lysura had expected, gray-haired, brown-skinned. She had a scar that ran from her left jawline to her collarbone, old, clearly pre-medical, the kind of mark that meant it had been earned somewhere without access to proper treatment. She extended her hand. Lysura had been briefed on the handshake. He knew it was a human contact greeting, an ancient gesture of showing an empty weapon hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were direct. She looked at him the way people look at things they're genuinely interested in, not calculating, not performing, curious. Ambassador, she said, thank you for making the trip. I'll admit, We weren't sure how long it would take before someone came knocking. A slight smile. 300 years is a long time to wait. Lysura processed the words carefully. You knew we would come. We hoped, she said. Come on, let me show you around. What followed was 2 hours that Lysura would spend the rest of his life trying to accurately describe in his memoirs. The shipyard bay came first, an internal manufacturing facility capable of producing replacement hull sections, weapons components, and fully assembled shuttle craft, while the Prometheus was underway at FTL. The bay was staffed by 300 engineers and 12 fabrication intelligences. The noise was tremendous. The scale was hard to hold in the mind all at once. You can build things inside this ship, said his junior cultural attaché, a young Shalkari woman named Vinasha, her voice somewhere between scientific fascination and genuine alarm. Only ship-scale components, Admiral Voss said, as though this were a modest limitation. Anything larger than a frigate, we'd need an external yard. The armory deck came next. Lysura had visited the armories of 3 different military powers in his career. He knew what armories looked like: organized, secure, impressive in a deliberate, controlled way. A statement of capability, carefully curated for diplomatic viewing. The Prometheus armory deck was not curated. It was functional. Rows of powered combat armor in maintenance cradles stretching further than his visual range allowed. Weapon racks that covered entire walls. A live-fire training range where a squad of Marines in full gear was running a drill, sprinting, vaulting, firing with a speed and precision that made his security attaché stop walking entirely. How often do they train? The attaché asked quietly. Every day, Voss said. Every single day. The AI command center was the thing that produced the most visible discomfort among the delegation. 12 intelligences. The Conclave had always considered AI beyond a certain cognitive threshold theoretically dangerous, a category of risk that the elder races had agreed, by quiet consensus, not to pursue. Here were 12 of them, working in concert, seamlessly integrated into the ship's command structure, treated not as a theoretical danger but as colleagues. You're not concerned? Voss asked when she noticed the delegation's reaction. The Conclave has always maintained that artificial intelligences above a certain threshold carry inherent. We know, Voss said simply. We disagree. She nodded toward the nearest AI station, a pillar of softly glowing interface panels. That's Command Intelligence 7. She helped design our long-range sensor array. She's also learning to paint in her spare cycles. A small pause. We find it's good for morale. At the end of the tour, Voss brought them to the observation deck. The viewport stretched the full width of the Prometheus command spine, a panoramic window that looked down on the Sol system with breathtaking clarity. Below them, Earth, blue and white and impossibly alive, wrapped in a shimmering haze of orbital traffic, ships of every size from personal transports to heavy freighters, moving in complex orbital lanes. Colonies on the moon, visible as lights on the surface. A massive station at the L2 point, rotating slowly, the size of a small city. Lysura stood at the viewport and looked for a long time. Then slowly, he turned his gaze outward, to the other ships holding position in the system. He counted carefully. 1, 2, 3. He kept counting. When he reached 8, not including the Prometheus beneath his feet, he stopped, not because he'd reached the end of the visible fleet. Because he'd realized he didn't want to know the actual number. Admiral, he said, his voice very controlled, how many of these vessels does humanity have? Hara Voss stood beside him, hands clasped behind her back, looking out at the planet below with an expression that was entirely calm, entirely comfortable, the expression of someone standing somewhere they belong. She was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Enough, she said. And in the silence that followed, Lysura, 40 years a diplomat, a man who had talked 3 civilizations back from the edge of extinction, a person trained from birth to remain unruffled by the unexpected, felt something move through him that he hadn't felt since childhood. He felt small. The report from the Saul delegation landed on every senior desk in the conclave simultaneously. It was not a short report. It was, in fact, the longest first contact assessment in 3,000 years of galactic diplomacy. 112 pages of careful, thorough, deeply unsettled analysis. It included full sensor data, architectural assessments, weapons array estimates, notes on human psychology, sociological summaries, and, somewhat unusually for a diplomatic report, a full page written by the cultural attaché, Venetia, which began with the sentence, "I do not think we have words in any of our languages for what we encountered, so I will attempt to build new ones." The conclave chamber convened the following morning and proceeded to argue for 4 months. The Vreth faction, led by Vreth Kalon, whose composure had survived the Eternal Accord tour largely intact, pushed hard for a structured integration framework. Humanity would be welcomed warmly, a seat on the Junior Council, observed expansion rights, new colony worlds would require conclave approval. And most critically, a voluntary arms limitation agreement, a treaty framework that would cap the number of Titan-class vessels humanity could operate, restrict weapons development beyond current capability, and establish oversight protocols for the AI command intelligences. "We are not threatening them," Vreth Kalon said carefully. "We are being prudent. We integrate every new species with guardrails. It is our standard process." "The standard process," said Councillor Shalvurin of the Akarath, dry as always, "was designed for species who could not have destroyed us if the talks went badly." This produced a silence that lasted nearly a full minute. The Shalkari faction leaned toward open integration, full membership, no arms limitations, a relationship built on trust rather than managed fear. Their senior representative, Ambassador Kelseras, made the argument plainly. "They have had FTL capability for over 2 centuries. They have had the ability to visit us at any time. They have not. They waited for us to come to them. What does that tell you?" What it told different people in the chamber, it turned out, was very different things. The debates went in circles for weeks. Subcommittees were formed. Position papers were written. A working group on AI governance policy was convened and produced no actionable recommendations. A second working group was formed to review the first. Meanwhile, in the Akarath's outer territories, something was happening that the committees were not moving fast enough to address. The Draal had no diplomatic representation in the conclave chamber because the Draal had never wanted one. They were a species from beyond the galactic boundary, nomadic, expansionist, organized around a military hierarchy so total that the distinction between civilian and soldier had long since ceased to exist in their culture. They had raided the Rim before. Hit-and-run attacks on isolated colonies, quickly repelled, never escalating to full war. The elder races had classified them as a chronic irritant, dangerous to individual colonies, but not to civilization. That assessment proved catastrophically wrong. The Draal fleet that entered Akarath space numbered 400 vessels, not raiders, not advanced scouts, an invasion force. They hit 17 systems in the first wave, moving with a speed and coordination that the Akarath's border defense forces were not structured to meet. There were no demands, no ultimatums, no communications of any kind. They simply arrived and began burning everything that couldn't run fast enough. The Akarath Colonial Administration sent urgent requests to the conclave. The conclave formed an emergency military committee. The committee began assessing available response forces. The assessment was complicated by the fact that multiple species had contributed ships to a shared conclave rapid response fleet that had never actually been deployed at scale, and whose command protocols had 3 conflicting sets of documentation. The border colony of Vethkaras sent a distress signal on the 4th day. Then it sent a second one, more urgent. Then, on the 6th day, it went silent. Its population was 400,000. The conclave's military committee projected that a formal response force could be assembled and deployed in approximately 3 weeks. The Akarath foreign minister, a figure not known for emotional public displays, stood in the chamber and said, quietly and precisely, that 3 weeks was not adequate, that Vethkaras was one of 7 border colonies now under active attack, that her people were dying while the chamber held procedural meetings. Nobody in the room had a good answer for her. Then the chamber's communications officer raised her hand. "Ambassador," she said, "we've just received a transmission from a human vessel, the ISV Prometheus. Admiral Voss sends her regards and asks the chamber to note the following." She paused, reading the screen in front of her. That 3 Titan-class warships, 6 support carriers, and 30,000 Marines have been dispatched to the Akarath border as of 6 hours ago. Admiral Voss states, and I'm reading this verbatim, "You can censure us after we're done. If the committee wants to discuss protocols, we're happy to talk when we get back. But right now we're going to go get those people out." The chamber erupted. The Vreth delegation was loudest. This was an unauthorized military deployment into a sovereign conflict zone, a violation of conclave protocols, an act of unilateral aggression that set a dangerous precedent. Councillor Shalvern's voice cut through the noise, quiet, precise, the way a blade is precise. "They dispatched 6 hours ago," she said. "They made the decision before they even notified us." She looked around the chamber. "They were already going. They just thought we deserved to know." The chamber went quiet. "That," Shalvern said, "is not aggression." A pause. "That is something else." Human Ambassador Jonas Merrick, who had been sitting in the human delegation's observer box throughout all 4 months of debate, with the patient, attentive calm of someone who has been watching a very long meeting and has decided to let it run its course, leaned forward in his chair. He said nothing. He simply waited. The Draal had conquered 16 worlds in the last 3 centuries. Not raided, not occupied temporarily. Conquered, absorbed into their fleet structure as resource extraction points, their populations integrated by force into the Draal military hierarchy, their infrastructure repurposed for war production. 16 worlds, 16 victories, and no meaningful resistance from anything in the galaxy that claimed to oppose them. This was not because the elder races were weak. They had ships. They had weapons. They had, in several cases, numerical advantages that should have made the Draal's expansion untenable. What they did not have was the willingness to absorb the kind of casualties that stopping the Draal actually required. Galactic warfare had evolved over millennia into something civilized, measured engagements, proportional responses, losses managed within politically acceptable limits. You fought until one side suffered unacceptable losses, then you negotiated. This was how rational, advanced species behaved. The Draal understood this perfectly. It was the foundation of their entire military doctrine. Hit hard enough to make resistance more expensive than surrender, and the rational opponent would eventually choose to negotiate or withdraw, every time, without fail. They had never encountered an opponent who didn't follow that calculation. They were about to. The Draal fleet holding Vethkaras numbered 412 vessels by the time the Human Response Force dropped out of FTL. Standard tactical doctrine, for any conclave species, would have required a comparable numerical response before engagement, or the engagement would not occur. 412 ships against 3 was not a battle. It was not even a decision. It was simply a fact about force disparity that any sane commander would acknowledge and retreat from. Admiral Voss was not unaware of this calculus. She had simply concluded, after studying the Draal's engagement history in detail during the FTL transit, that the calculus was built on an assumption that didn't apply here. The ISV Prometheus dropped out of FTL inside the Draal formation. Not near it, not at the edge of it. Inside it, 2 kilometers from the nearest Draal command vessel, surrounded on every vector by enemy ships, in a position that every tactical system in the galaxy would have classified as a catastrophic navigational error. The Draal fleet did not immediately fire, not out of hesitation or mercy, But because their targeting systems needed a full 3 seconds to classify what had just appeared in their midst, and 3 seconds is a very long time. In those 3 seconds, the Prometheus broadcasted on every frequency the Draal fleet used. This is Admiral Hara Voss of the United Earth Interstellar Navy. You are in violation of the territorial sovereignty of the Akarath Dominion. You have 400,000 civilians on a world below us who are not combatants. I am asking you, one time, to withdraw. The Draal fleet opened fire. What happened next lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes and was witnessed in real time by 5 Akarath military observation posts that had gone dark but were, unknown to the Draal, still transmitting on passive sensors. The footage those sensors captured would be studied, replayed, and debated in military academies across the galaxy for the next century. The Prometheus point defense systems came online in the first half-second of the engagement. The Draal's opening salvo, a coordinated strike from over 200 vessels designed to saturate any known defense grid, produced 0 hull damage. Not reduced damage. 0. The defensive web was so comprehensive, so fast, so precisely calibrated that it was, in the words of one Akarath analyst, less like a defense and more like the weapon simply ceased to exist upon arrival. The Prometheus did not return fire immediately. For 11 seconds, an eternity in active combat, she simply stood there, absorbing the Draal's strike and did nothing. Later, when asked about those 11 seconds, Admiral Voss was characteristically direct. I wanted them to understand that their best hadn't been good enough before I showed them ours. Then the Prometheus main guns fired. There is no poetic way to describe what a Titan-class main battery does to a ship. There are only measurements. The yield per discharge, the dispersal radius, the number of Draal vessels that ceased to exist in the first firing sequence versus the number that were structurally compromised versus the number that, recognizing what was happening, attempted to withdraw. The 2 flanking Titan-class ships, the ISV Achilles and the ISV Kali, had come out of FTL during the first exchange, positioned at the formation's exit vectors. Not blocking retreat aggressively, simply present. Simply there. The way a wall is there. The Draal did not know how to retreat. 4 centuries of military culture had no mechanism for it, no protocol, no contingency planning, no doctrine. You fought or you died. Those were the options. The Prometheus let them choose for 3 hours and 40 minutes. At the 4-hour mark, the choice had been made for all 412 vessels by the simple arithmetic of what was left of them. During the battle, while the Achilles and Kali managed the engagement perimeter, human transport ships had been running continuous orbital drops to Vethkaras, pre-assembled emergency shelter modules, medical units, food fabricators, a full field hospital, dropped into the burning colony from orbit, through the battle, with a navigational precision that left every Akarath observer speechless. The civilians on Vethkaras had shelter and medical care before the last Draal ship went silent. The Prometheus sent one final transmission to the remaining Draal military command on the other side of the galactic boundary. It contained no threats, no demands, no political language of any kind. It contained the sensor data from the engagement, all of it, complete and unedited. In case you're curious about what happened, the message read, we'll be here if you'd like to discuss next steps. The Draal did not discuss next steps. They never entered conclave space again. The galactic resonance network was unusual in the weeks after Vethkaras. Not quiet, it never fully went quiet, but different. Traffic patterns shifted. Certain diplomatic channels that had been busy for years went idle. Others, that had barely registered activity in decades, suddenly hummed with encrypted communication. Intelligence analysts across 6 species spent those weeks trying to map the new pattern and kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The galaxy was thinking. Collectively, quietly, and without wanting to be seen doing it. The conclave convened its censure session for the unauthorized human deployment as promised. It was, by all accounts, the strangest censure session in the chamber's history. Ambassador Jonas Merrick attended alone. No legal team, no diplomatic staff, no prepared materials. He sat at the delegation table with a cup of the hot liquid humans consumed coffee, the translation notes helpfully supplied, and waited for the chamber to begin. Vreth Kalon opened with a prepared statement condemning the unilateral deployment as a violation of conclave sovereignty protocols, a dangerous precedent, and a fundamental breach of the framework under which galactic security was managed. It was a good statement, well-constructed, legally precise. Merrick listened to all of it without interrupting. When Vreth Kalon finished, Merrick nodded slowly, as though he had genuinely heard every word and was giving it honest consideration. Then he said, 400,000 people on Veth Karas are alive. Your committee's timeline would have arrived 3 weeks after the last of them died. I understand the protocol concern. I'm asking you to weigh it against that number. He picked up his coffee. We acted without authorization, he continued, and we will accept whatever formal censure the chamber decides is appropriate. We will sign whatever protocol revision you propose to prevent a similar situation. We will cooperate fully with any oversight framework. He looked around the room, not challenging, not performing, simply present and clear. But I want to be honest with you, because I think that matters more right now than being diplomatic. If it happens again, if there are people dying while a committee meets, we're going to go. Every time. And I'd rather we find a framework that accommodates that than one that doesn't. The censure motion failed to pass. 14 abstentions, 8 votes against, 6 votes in favor, all Vreth voting on principle. It was the Akarath foreign minister, whose people the humans had just saved, whose colonial dead included people she had personally known, who declined to vote at all. She simply sat in her delegation box and looked at Jonas Merrick for a long moment. Then she looked away. Later, after the session, she found him in a corridor. She stood with him in silence for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was very quiet and not at all diplomatic, "Thank you." Merrick nodded, no speech, no statement for the record, just, "Of course." The ripple effects moved outward through the galaxy in the following months like the slow expansion of a shockwave, invisible to any single sensor array but detectable in the cumulative data. The border dispute between the Tarani Collective and the Shield Protectorate, a conflict that had been grinding slowly forward for 11 years with no resolution in sight, produced a peace agreement within 6 weeks of Veth Karas. The official statement cited changed diplomatic conditions and a reassessment of strategic priorities. No analyst believed this explanation. Everyone understood the actual one. The Vreth Conclave's arms limitation proposal for humanity was quietly withdrawn without formal announcement. An internal memo, later leaked, described the withdrawal as a strategic recalibration in light of emerging data. The official who wrote the memo was reassigned to a junior post in the Outer Territories. The Draal Boundary Commission, an organization that had existed for 40 years to negotiate the theoretical containment of Draal expansion, dissolved itself. Its final statement was one sentence: "The matter has been resolved through other means." And in the outer spiral arm, on the small blue world that had been forgotten for 3 centuries, something else was happening. Humanity was receiving applications. Not from governments, from individuals. Scientists, engineers, artists, philosophers, species that had heard the story of Veth Karas and wanted to understand the beings who had done it, who had dropped a field hospital from orbit during a 4-hour battle, who had broadcasted raw sensor data to a defeated enemy instead of a victory statement, who had walked into a chamber expecting censure and had brought coffee. The first alien student enrolled at the University of Cape Town on a Tuesday in what humans called November. She was a young Shalkari botanist named Churiklan, no relation to the captain whose navigation error had started all of this, who wanted to study Earth's ecosystems. She arrived nervous. She left 4 years later, fluent in 3 human languages, with a doctoral thesis on convergent evolutionary biology, and with 6 humans she described in her memoir as the closest friends she had ever had. She was not the last. Jonas Merrick stood before the full conclave chamber one final time in his capacity as ambassador. He was retiring, 22 years of representation. His hair had gone gray in the job human aging, a biological reality that several species found unexpectedly moving. They grew old visibly. Time left marks on them in ways that other species could simply see, simply read. Vreth Kalon, who had argued against him in this same chamber dozens of times, had said privately that there was something about watching a human age through their diplomatic career that made it difficult to dismiss them. They carry time differently than we do, he'd said. It costs them more. The chamber was full. Not the polite fullness of mandatory attendance, genuinely full, every seat taken, standing space occupied, observer galleries open and filled with delegations and staff. Species that rarely attended in person had sent physical representatives. The Shalkari Senior Council had come as a body. Even the Akarath Grand Admiral, technically retired, technically not in official capacity, was present in the upper gallery. Merrick stood at the central podium without notes. He looked out at the chamber for a moment. 43 species, 43 histories, 43 different ways of understanding the universe, all looking back at him. Humanity came to this chamber 22 years ago, he said, and found 43 civilizations that had built something remarkable. A network, a framework, an agreement passed down across 3,000 years that said, we are going to figure out how to exist together, and that is going to be harder than war, but it is going to be worth it. He paused. We want to be part of that agreement, genuinely, not as a military guarantee, not as a protective framework, not as the species with the large ships that everyone is quietly grateful to have on their side. We want to be members, citizens of whatever this is. He gestured around the chamber. We want to argue in these halls about trade policy and territorial boundaries and the incredibly tedious business of building something that works. Quiet laughter from several delegation boxes. The tension in the room eased fractionally. We are aware, he said more carefully now, that our presence changes the balance of this room. We are aware that how we conduct ourselves matters, not just for our own interests, but for the stability of everything that's been built here. We take that seriously. We took it seriously when we sent ships to Vethkaras, and we'll take it seriously every time we act going forward. He looked around the room one more time. We're not here to be in charge. We're not here to be worshipped or feared or put in some category that makes it easier to deal with us. We're here because this is the neighborhood, and we want to be good neighbors. A small smile. We do expect that if something tries to burn the neighborhood down, you'll let us answer the door. The vote on full conclave membership for humanity passed 41-2. The 2 opposing votes were both Vreth proceduralists voting on grounds of insufficient review time, not opposition in principle, but principle in process. Even Vreth Kalon voted yes. Afterward in the corridor, he approached Merrick and extended his hand. A gesture he had clearly practiced, awkward but genuine. You are a frustrating species, he said, in the closest thing to warmth his formal cadence allowed. Merrick shook his hand. We've heard that before. The Prometheus was not present for the vote. She was 3 weeks into a 6-month patrol of the outer territories, one of 4 rotating human vessels that now held a quiet, unannounced watch along the galactic boundary. Not because anyone had asked them to, not because any treaty required it. Because Admiral Voss had looked at the maps, identified the places the conclave's formal security framework didn't fully cover, and assigned ships. When a conclave administrator had asked about the legal authority for the patrol, her liaison officer, with the specific kind of patience that suggests the question has been anticipated, had replied, no authority. We just thought it was worth doing. The administrator had started to object, run through the procedural concern in her head, and then stopped. Because 400,000 people on Vethkaras were alive. She filed the patrol notification under Voluntary Human Security Activities, a new administrative category she had created specifically for this purpose, and moved on. 200 years passed. The galaxy changed, as galaxies do, slowly, profoundly, in ways that were only fully visible in retrospect. New species made contact, trade routes expanded, old disputes were resolved and new ones arose. The conclave's bureaucracy, to the occasional exasperation of everyone involved, continued to produce committees at a rate that suggested it would eventually outpace the stars themselves. But underneath all of it, something had shifted, something structural. The way the bedrock shifts when a new foundation is set, invisible to anyone standing on the surface, but present in the way buildings stand afterward. The drawl never returned to conclave space. No follow-up engagement, no proxy aggression, no contact of any kind. There were academic theories about why a political collapse, internal conflict, simple geographical reconsideration. None of them were ever confirmed because no conclave expedition ventured past the boundary to check, and no one from the other side came to explain. The prevailing theory, which appeared in 3 different major journals across 5 species, was simply, they did the math. 3 border disputes that had been classified as chronic unresolvable territorial conflicts were reclassified, within 20 years of humanity's full conclave membership, as historically resolved. Analysts who traced the timelines found that resolution had accelerated in each case within 6 months of a human diplomatic team being assigned as observers. The humans never applied pressure, never threatened, never advocated for a particular outcome. They simply attended the meetings. With coffee. And somehow, in their presence, the timeline of this conflict will eventually exhaust itself, compressed from decades to months. The ISV Prometheus was decommissioned in what humans called the year 2621. She was not scrapped. The proposal to scrap her, made by a junior budget administrator who had clearly not thought through the political implications, produced a response from the conclave that could charitably be described as unanimous, strongly worded disagreement, and less charitably described as something resembling panic. Instead, she was placed in permanent station-keeping orbit above neutral station Kepler-7, a trading and diplomatic hub positioned roughly at the galactic midpoint, one of the most trafficked points in the known galaxy. Her weapons systems were deactivated. Her crew was reduced to a maintenance detachment of 300 volunteers from 19 species, rotating on 2-year assignments, responsible for keeping her hull clean, her systems functional, and her running lights on. Always on. There was no official resolution passed to explain this, no formal designation. The running lights decision appeared in the decommissioning documentation as a single line, added by the conclave's facilities committee after approximately 4 minutes of discussion. Running lights to remain operational indefinitely, maintenance allocated accordingly. No explanation given. No explanation needed. Commander Yeva Han had served on 5 vessels in her 20-year career with the human interstellar navy. She was now assigned to the Prometheus maintenance crew, her last posting before retirement, chosen deliberately. She had asked for it. She did a lot of her thinking on the observation deck. The Prometheus observation deck looked exactly as it had 200 years ago. The long viewport spanning the command spine, the faint hum of the old power systems in the deck plates, the view of Kepler-7 station beyond the viewport, and further out, the stars. New species came through Kepler-7 regularly now. The pace of first contact had accelerated dramatically over the last century. Humanity's integration into the conclave had coincided with an expansion of the contact protocols, a reduction in the bureaucratic delay between detection and outreach. They came in nervous, hopeful, stunned by the scale of what they were joining. And when they were brought to Kepler-7 on their first official visit, the tour, the presentations, the formal welcome from the conclave's diplomatic corps, someone always arranged for them to pass by the observation deck near the docking corridor. The view from there was calibrated. The station's rotation meant that the Prometheus was visible for exactly 4 minutes from that corridor's viewport, lit by her own running lights against the dark, still as a mountain, enormous in a way that became clear gradually as your eye found references and lost them and found them again. The guides always slowed down at that point, always gave the new species time to look. And the new species, every time without exception, always asked the same question. Han had heard it so many times she had stopped consciously processing it. It had become background, like the hum of the deck plates, part of the Prometheus ambient reality. What is that? And the guide would explain. The Titan-class designation, the history, Vethkaras, the drawl, the vote, the 200 years, and then at the end they would gesture at the running lights, those patient, constant, unwavering lights, and say, "She's not armed anymore. She can't go anywhere. She has a crew of 300 doing maintenance and nothing else." A pause always. But she's been here for 200 years, and she'll be here tomorrow, and the galaxy knows it. The new species would look at the lights for a while. The questions they asked after were always different curiosities, different concerns, different angles of approach. Each species had its own way of trying to understand. But the silence before the questions was always the same. That specific silence, the kind that meant something had landed, that somewhere between the eye and the mind, a thing had been understood that couldn't quite be put into words yet. Han walked the Prometheus corridors on her off shifts. She knew every section, every compartment, every particular sound the old ship made in the night cycle. The chapel on deck 14, original, unchanged, still used by every rotation of the maintenance crew that came through. The fabrication bay, quiet now, its machines cold but preserved. The armory deck, empty of weapons but maintained in perfect condition, because some things you maintained whether you needed them immediately or not. That was a human lesson. That had always been a human lesson. She had read Venusha's memoir, the Shalkari botanist who had enrolled at Cape Town 2 centuries ago, the first alien student, the one who had written about her 6 human friends in terms that had made 3 different species cry in their first-year conclave history courses. Venusha had lived to be very old, by Shalkari standards, and had spent most of her long career writing about the strangeness and warmth and baffling tenacity of the species she had studied. Her most quoted line, the one that appeared in history texts and diplomatic handbooks, and improbably on a small plaque near the Prometheus boarding ramp, read, "They are afraid of everything. They have always been afraid. They built the largest thing in the galaxy out of that fear, and then they used it to save people they had never met. I spent 40 years trying to understand this. I no longer think it requires understanding. I think it only requires gratitude." On a quiet night cycle, in the empty observation deck, Commander Yevahan sat with her feet up on the console and looked out at the stars. Below in the distance, small from here, just lights Kepler 7 station moved in its slow orbit. Ships came and went. Trade happened. Arguments happened. Committees met. Species that had once been trying to kill each other argued about tariff structures instead, which was, on balance, an improvement. The Prometheus held her position, patient, lit. Han thought about the question the new species always asked. Why? She had her own answer. It wasn't the official one, not the diplomatic language about deterrence and symbolic presence and the value of institutional continuity. Her answer was simpler and probably less respectable. Because something might come out of the dark, she thought, looking at the stars. And when it does, someone should already be here, already waiting, already awake. She looked at the running lights reflected in the viewport glass. That's what we do, she thought, we stay awake. She sat there for a long time, in the quiet and the dark and the light, with the hum of the old ship around her and the stars beyond the glass. And the galaxy, enormous and old and full of voices, turned around its center. And the lights stayed on. And